Welcome to Hip Hop Now Podcast. If you're from the future, you know what to do. Get your ass out of here. Don't disrespect the legend. Hip hop is here to stay. Let's get right into the business. What up, y'all? I am your host, Vegas, and this is Hip Hop Now Podcast, a podcast specifically designed to keep you caught up on all things hip hop music and culture that happened throughout the week. Big shout out to the supporters, the producers over at patreon.com. And if you would like to become a producer, well, visit the link in the description. It says patreon.com/hip hop now. 50 years of hip hop. Before I begin, next week, come on, man, we're not going to play those games. If you're from the future, you've already seen this. It's already happened. But next week is officially the 50th anniversary of hip-hop music and culture. And I have a very, very special episode for you. Now, I'm not going to say what it is, but I'm going to say that considering it's 50 years of hip-hop, considering we've seen a lot of coverage and will continue to do so, I assume, after the birthday of hip-hop, it's difficult sometimes to say, what can I do that I haven't already done to celebrate hip-hop? What can I do to commemorate the birthday of hip-hop? Now, I've already done an entire show going through the timeline and history of hip-hop. So if you are a person who is just new to this game, whether it's because you're young, whether because you never got into hip-hop really, and you just kind of wanted to know the gist of its history throughout time, the players, the people, the impact players in particular, please, by all means, check out the episode of That Time in Hip Hop where we celebrate 50 years with my co-hosts Tony from IntoTheDome.com and Yentz from a show that I used to do called Hip Hop Twitter. I guess it would be Hip Hop X. Man, I'm glad we stopped when we did. Perfect timing. But nevertheless, next week's episode for Hip Hop Now podcast will be a list. And you know how people love lists. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe here. Subscribe, whether you listening to audio or you watch it on YouTube. Subscribe. Trying to grow my audience. I think I'm around 300, which is cool because it was much lower than that at one point. But let's get to 500 and let's get to 1,000. If I could get to 1,000, it'd be great. But the only way I get that to that amount of subscribers is through people like you who enjoy this content and share it with others. That's all you got to do. Throw it up in the forum. Go to Reddit. Go to Discord. Go to your timeline. Just share, and share your feelings about the podcast because that's what's most important. It's not important to say, hey, help my man out. No. Yo, I enjoy this podcast. Y'all should check it out. That's all. Now, big shout out to hiphopdx.com, ambrosiaforheads.com, XXLmagazine.com, and a couple of places where I'm getting these stories from. Let's get right into the business. So Offset of Migos, if you don't know, had this to say, and I'm reading this from hiphopdx.com. Offset argues Migos are top 5 all-time hip-hop group. And this is what he says. We changed the sound of music. Now, let's get a little deeper into those quotes. It depends on how people looking at it. If you're talking about culturally change the sound of music, because then we went past hip-hop and we went to country and all the different genres, I just feel like we could have got top 5. Okay. So let's not get too deep into it. You can check out the article on hiphopdx.com. Let me say this first. I'm going to represent the old heads, if you don't mind. I like Migos. Now, am I a buy every album, like every song kind of dude? Not really. I'm more or less, I like the songs I like. Uh, there's probably one album I prefer over the rest, and for the younger cats, they probably like, yo, that's not the one. But for me, it was. What I liked about Migos when they dropped was they had a unique flow for the time, right? Not just all time, but for the time, they had a unique flow. And the flow was so unique that their peers, including Drake, who I don't believe was a peer, but I guess you could call him a peer, kind of bit their style, right? They started rapping like them. And it was a thing where it was kind of corny because everybody was rapping like that. But then when you heard Migos rap, you felt like, nah, this is the origins of that style. And only them doing that style matters because it's their style. I agree with Offset from that standpoint because whether you want to like it or not, as an old head, they did that. They had their own style, right? They stood out. They did the hip hop thing. They stood out from their peers, from their counterparts with their style. It's no different from Das Effect style or someone else's style. They separated themselves. So I agree with him in that regard as far as the impact of Migos on the culture, on a generation at that time. But when you say top five groups of all time, well, I have to stop you there because the criteria kind of shifts when you're talking about that, right? It's not just about style, it's not just about success, it's not just about impact. Now, sure, their generation bit off their style for the most part. So you could say there's impact. But you're talking about a generation that does that all the time. So much that it's defeated the purpose to even defend stealing styles because it's commonplace to do that. And fans, it's not all fans, but most fans don't care about that. Old heads are the one who uphold the rules. Now, there's some younger cats who do care, right? For example, I'm not the biggest Lil Baby fan. I'm not the biggest Future fan, but I prefer Future over Lil Baby. And I remember looking at some reviews in the past of his albums, and I never knew or I never paid attention to the fact that there are people who felt like he's just a lackluster version of Future. And I was like, wow, I think that's the first time I ever heard that. And then I did some more research and I was like, oh, well, it's not common as that's what everybody thinks about him, but there's a good amount of people who don't mess with him for that very reason. So it's like the rules are there, but they're not, you know what I mean? But when it comes to top five, all time, changing the culture, you can look at groups who didn't have a counterpart similar to them at all. Like you can look at Run DMC, who are uniquely them, and in a lot of ways, their music shifted the culture. Outkast, right? Nobody was doing what Outkast was doing, right? Of course, their style shifted the culture. You could even look at artists that are just as unique, right? Like Mobb Deep is a very unique group with a distinctive sound, right? I'm pretty sure they influenced a bunch of people. Now the thing is what is the criteria for top five all time? So if I'm going with Offset's definition, what I think is what he's saying, it's about Migos' style. It's about how many people follow that style, right? It's about their success and their place in hip hop. And I think in a lot of ways they are one of the top groups or one of the best groups in hip hop history, but they're not top five. top five. I can't look. Put it this way, y'all. Before we move on, when I think about top five and placing somebody somewhere, the first thing you have to say to yourself is, who are you going to put them in front of? Are you going to put Migos in front of Run DMC? Are you going to put Migos in front of Outkast? Are you? Are you going to put Migos in front of NWA or Public Enemy? You might. I mean, they kind of kept the group thing alive in hip hop because it's rare. They might be the only ones. Are you going to put Migos in front of a Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul? I don't know. I don't think so. So whereas they may be able to eke into a top 10, maybe, and old heads, calm down. We ain't talking about Bar Kings, right? Because at the end of the day, when it comes to Locke's albums, you know, like I know, there's some great songs and there's some really bad songs. So I'm just saying, the criteria just shifts all around the place. And some people look at top groups based off of the music, skill, and that's it, which is cool. Migos falls way down that list, probably damn near fall out the list, at least as far as top 10 goes. Uh, so, yeah, I'm not mad at his comments, but at the end of the day, I'm kind of like, come on, dog. Come on, man. Come on. I ain't say it like that on purpose. I'm just saying, come on. We, you are entitled to your opinion. But you already know the internet. Start saying top five, placing your group in there. The comments is on fire. Your timeline is on fire. So, West Side Gun did something that caught my attention because I get it. It's kind of like sports, right? Where they're talking to a player and they're like, do you feel like you're the greatest of all time? Of course, they're supposed to feel like that. That's the competitive fire. No one should be mad at that. Even if they are far from the best of all time, that's the way they're supposed to project, right? Because sometimes you project that and you kind of become that in the eyes of the public. It's like Floyd Mayweather, right? The best to ever do it or whatever. Best ever. The best ever. TB. A lot of people go with it. Yo, the GOAT is here. Best to ever do it. No, 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 no. Casuals. No. The best to ever do it will forever be Sugar Ray Robinson, unless somebody who does what he does and more comes along. Now, the way Terrence Crawford beat up Errol Spence is pretty close, especially if you've watched Terrence Crawford fight and you know his style. But nevertheless, West Side Gun on a regular basis will grandstand and promote himself as the greatest curator in hip hop today. And, you know, whatever top spot he can claim, he will claim. And some of it I like because that's what I like about him rapping. But this one, I don't know. He takes credit for hidden album features trend, saying he is 10 steps ahead. Now, if you're listening and you're like, well, what does that mean? It means having somebody on your album in general, it means having a feature on your album that is like a big feature, but it's a surprise. Like you either won't know until you hear it for the most part, or see it because it dropped at midnight. Now you see the features and it's like, oh, I never noticed that Jay-Z was on this joint. It didn't say Jay-Z, or they released a fake list, or whatever the case may be. Now we are living in a feature heavy time. So heavy that now, before they even release a single, releasing the artwork and more importantly, releasing the track listing is a thing. It's a thing. People like it. It is a thing. And the first thing people do in hip hop today is just scroll down that list and find out who's on it, right? that's almost become more important than just seeing an album cover and seeing the titles and being interested in, yo, I wonder what that's about. I wonder what that's about. It's really like the features. Oh, he got boom, boom, boom. And sometimes, depending on the amount of features or the combination of features, people will get excited because they feel like it was gonna be crazy. He got everybody on. He got Hove, he got Nas, he got Jadakiss, he got Eminem, he got this one, they got Travis Scott, I guess, whoever. Uh, and people will get excited because of that. And it is a thing, but he didn't really invent it. Now, if you want to say he played a role in popularizing it, well, maybe, okay, maybe, because I don't think anybody thinks about that. Now, there's another thing with that also. It's great for the fans because it just builds excitement. But is he saying I started the trend of like making that a popular thing because fans get into it? Or a trend of just, and he probably means more so this, but a trend of other artists using the same marketing tactics to build excitement and anticipation for the album by having a hidden feature. Like, I remember albums back in the days where I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but you're listening and you hear the rapping, you like look at the track list and you're like, wait, is that Redman on that song? Then you realize he is. And in some cases, you didn't see the credits and you don't know if there's a mistake, right? And when I say credits, like when you look at the track list and you see featuring blah, 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 blah. I remember looking at one album, I can't remember. I think it was Sticky Fingers album, um, Black Trash, the autobiography of Kirk Jones. Don't sleep. It's all right. One of the best concept albums of all time in hip hop. But I think I remember that where I think I had a copy where it didn't say the guest appearances on this one particular song. And then I recognized the voices and I'm like, oh, I know they were on here. And sure, it built some excitement in the moment, but what's that gonna stop it? Stop it. I like your music. I mean, you got me to like you as an artist over the years. To the point I anticipate your music because I think he's right when it comes to the curation for his projects, at least. Um, it's usually looks promising and sometimes it meets those expectations. So you can say he started the trend, but I say no, he did not. Maybe he made it popular again. Who knows? And lastly, recently, the anniversary of Main Source's debut album, Breaking Atoms, passed. The album was released in 1991. It is an album that is clearly a hip hop classic for that time. I think in a lot of ways, Large Professor was ahead of his time lyrically and mostly based off his social commentary. It wasn't that, oh, looking at the front door is a record about a relationship. It just was like a real relationship. Like the perspective he spoke from, right? It wasn't like, oh, these are the things that people do when they're together and they fight. It was relatable, right? It wasn't cliche and what you would see or hear. It was extremely relatable. And with the glasses and mustache, for some reason, he looked like he was 37 years old, but he was not. Uh, so the anniversary came up, and for those who don't know, let's just go over the brief history. Main Source was a group released their debut album in 1991. One rapper being Large Professor, who's also a producer. The group also featured two other DJs, and there's a famous line on A Tribe Called Quest, Midnight Marauders, where he disses them, which is kind of dope at the same time. But they split up, right? And this album also speaks about police brutality. Yes, it didn't just happen, y'all. We can go back before Main Source, but A Friendly Game of Baseball. Check it out. Listen to the lyrics. It's about police brutality. But probably one of the biggest things that people take away from this album is this was the introduction to Nas, right? Live at the Barbecue, 1991. Nas is, I went to hell for stuffing Jesus, and that's all people could talk about, right? Like, yo, who's this dude? Nas, you already said. Um, that's Breaking Atoms in a nutshell. They eventually broke up, and Large Professor went solo. The two DJs, I don't know where the hell they went. I didn't even know. I don't know where they went, honestly. I forgot. Um, but the anniversary came up, and I believe they kind of all squashed that long-standing beef from years ago. Rightfully so. It's been a long time. But more importantly, they have now released a sort of lost tapes album, right? This album is a couple of songs they recorded between the release of their debut, Breaking Atoms, and the breakup. So it's like 91 to 94 songs they were working on, I guess, for what would have been their sophomore album. And I'm not going to hold you. I really, really like it. Now, Lost Tapes is essentially unreleased records, in some cases, unfinished records. And it's just this compilation of best of what wasn't released. You know, Nas famously has an album, Nas The Lost Tapes, which, in my opinion, is a hip hop classic. And the only musicians, and y'all can name some in the comments, but the only musicians or artists to me that's ever released a unreleased situation or even a best of um that people could consider a classic, that's an elite level of accomplishment. But nevertheless, the name of the project is The Science. And what I like about it most is it is like a time capsule of hip hop around that time, the sound, the way rappers rap, the types of beats that were popular, right? The techniques, like this album is just like drums. All the drums is like loud, and you know what I'm saying? And Large Professor just shows that, man, this brother, you talk about concept albums. This cat could have done a concept album easy because he just has songs about everything. You know what I'm saying? And what I like about this album is you really have to put yourself in the mindset for context of the time. Probably the best way to do this, if you weren't around for the release of Breaking Atoms, to even know the sound of early 90s hip hop, is to go listen to Breaking Atoms and then listen to this and think of it as a sequel, not a sequel, think of it as a second album or an addition to that. Because the sound on Breaking Atoms mirrors the sound on this new album or this Lost Tapes, The Science. It takes you back to that point. And what I love about this, I mean, it's not going to be my top 5 of the year, but for damn sure it's going to be one of the best of the year, is how they did it. A lot of times, a Lost Tapes, an unreleased album is just give it a title, give it a cover, throw the songs on there. And you go through listening, knowing this is just random songs, no rhyme or reason. This joint has interludes all throughout that feature context for the records, for the time. And it just sets up the songs lovely because you just know, like, oh, okay, this is this. Now let me just go through and not just talk. Let me just look at the album as I speak to you about it. I'm talking just to get to it. Like, like I can't cuss, but you know what I mean. I'm BSing to get there so I can read. Okay. So The Science is 30 minutes in length, which is great. Don't take up a lot of my time. Give me an opportunity to hit rewind bars. Uh, 16 tracks, but again, you're talking about intro, song, interlude, song, interlude, song, interlude, song, 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 interlude, like that. And it's not annoying. Typically, that would be annoying, but it's almost like walking through a museum, a very short museum, of main source and unreleased material, and having, um, for the most part, large professor from the past guide you through, which is just so, well, I don't know if it's from the past. You know what it is? The brother's voice hasn't changed at all, so you can't even tell. So I don't know. He could have added these, but regardless, it just sets things up perfectly. Now, what I like about it is there's songs on here I never heard of before, right? Like there's a song called Television. And what I like about it that stood out is like back in the 90s and 80s, people thought about, especially hip hop, thought about television in the same way they think about social media and the internet. It's not good. The kids shouldn't be all engrossed in that. It's nonsense happening in there, misinformation, fake news, all of that. Television is that, but about television, which is crazy, right? Right? He made a whole song that's like a diss record to television called Television, but it's the social commentary on television and his perception and a lot of rappers' perception from back then that to me mirrors a lot of what we see today, but what we see with social media and the internet. It's the same argument, which is crazy to even think about, right? Because probably now most people think television is harmless in comparison to the internet. So, but what I also like is Looking at the Front Door is on here, but it's an uncut version, which is crazy because the beat is different. The rhymes are kind of the same, but not in a lot of ways, the way they roll out. So it's like, oh, so that was like a take on, like jazz, right? That was like a take on the song. What we originally heard was the final product. It was ready for the streets, it was ready for video and radio and all of that. Um, but this was like what we had first. That's what I like about it. Also, unreleased version of Faking the Funk. Now, I believe this might have been on something. I know they say unreleased, but I swear it was on something. But it's a different beat, totally different vibe from we first heard Faking the Funk on the White Man Can't Jump soundtrack, which that version ends off the album. But I got to tell you, man, I'm not even going to hold you. If you consider yourself on any level a hip hop fan, you love the history, not just love, oh, I love Migos and everybody that's new, or I love the 90s only. Like if you're a hip hop fan and with 50 years of hip hop, you really get into the history now more than ever because of the story behind this short-lived group that could have been one of the best groups of all time in hip hop, having a debut album that most consider to be a classic, having a second album that was not because it didn't feature Large Professor, so most people didn't care. A public, you know, battle between Large Professor and those cats, and just to have something, a project like this years later, that at least for the most part, most haven't heard, and have it play out in the way it does, where again, it's like an artifact. It's like a snapshot. It's like a capsule, a time capsule of not only 1991, but also this group and what could have been. That's what makes it dope. It's the what could have been. And when you listen to this, it's like, man, I would have loved to see, them get to like 4 or 5 albums. Like what does it look like? Because Lost Professor had some joints in the mid 90s. What does it look like if you had main source, the group? Not that the DJs did much, but as a group, as we knew them, just go through the years creating albums, right? Could have been really dope, but I'm glad we got this. So when it comes to the science, I think if you're a hip hop head, especially from back then, a main source fan, you want to listen to this. Even if you're curious, check it out. I think it's worth it. So that's going to do it for me. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Spill, and Threads, I guess, at Vegas World INC. Also know that this podcast is available where you get all your podcasts, no matter where you go. You know what I'm saying? Whether it be Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Overcast, whatever. Subscribe to Hip Hop Now Podcast. Comment where there's comments. Review where there's reviews. But most importantly, share with people you know enjoy this kind of content. If you are listening on audio form and you'd like to check out the video, same podcast, Hip Hop Now Podcast, is now on YouTube. Until next time, y'all, I'm not a critic, I'm a fan. Peace.